I have never done a reading wrap-up video. I think this is kind of a normal thing for a lot of people who talk about books on YouTube to wrap up their month of reading. I've never done it before because I prefer to do analytic stuff and reviews and spend time on one specific book or genre or collection of whatever. You know, you can look at my other stuff. But reading wrap-ups are popular, and I've actually had quite a few requests asking for reading wrap-ups every month, so it might be a thing I now do, and it might be fun. And also, another reason I do it is because I pretty much make a video on every book I ever read, but this time, no, there is at least one book on this stack that I haven't made a specific video about, and so I get to talk about, so that's great. I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to promote this. We just got this in the post. Not framed, we got the frame. This is a lino print. Jess and I have been getting into lino art and the idea of lino prints over the last few months. It's such a cool style of artwork. And there's this girl called Gemma Curtis who has a shop on Etsy, and she makes shop fronts. She just makes lino prints of shop fronts and then sells the copies, and they're lovely and they're very affordable. And this is a print of The Second Shelf, which I've talked about before. We've written articles and featured The Second Shelf. It's an amazing feminist bookshop in Soho, London. Please go visit The Second Shelf when they're open. Go visit their website. I bought a t-shirt from there. They're great, and this is such a cool piece of art. So support Gemma, support The Second Shelf, do all of that. This is a really cool thing to have. Another thing that's pretty cool about reading wrap-ups is you get to see how much you've actually read. Like, a lot of people keep notes on the books that they read, or they have a Goodreads account. I deleted my Goodreads account. I hated Goodreads. I find it very toxic and quite stressful. But I now see what books I've read this month, and I've read, I think, 10 books. 10's quite a lot for a month, I think. I'm not really sure. I don't keep tabs. But well, let's go through some of the books that I've read and what I thought about them. This is my April. Yeah, we're in April. This is my April. Also, the day that this video goes up will be my birthday, which is lovely, 28th of April. Happy birthday to me. I started the month by reading The Pisces, which I did a video on. It's my favourite video I've ever done. I loved doing this video. If you haven't watched it, it's a video where I look at 1-star reviews of this from people who really hated this book. They're always funny. And so I just kind of looked at how funny they were and then tore them apart and argued against whatever their silly point was. I loved that video, so please go watch it. The Pisces is a really terrific book. It is sexy, it is raunchy, it is dark, it is funny, it is twisted. It has a very unlikable, mentally ill protagonist who I related to in some ways and obviously hated in other ways, and that's the idea. It's a really terrific book that I cannot recommend enough. You have to be okay with a lot of strangeness. You have to be okay with a lot of very explicit sex. You have to be okay with discussions of mental illness in a really frank and almost off-putting way. And if you are, this is an incredible book. It also uses its dialogue, and I didn't mention this in my video, it uses its dialogue between its two love interests to kind of parody things like Twilight. When the protagonist meets and starts to fall in love with this merman, he starts to talk a little bit Edward Cullen-esque. He starts to talk in a really, really cheesy way about his mer powers and stuff, and it becomes far cheesier than it ever was, and you can tell it's being done on purpose in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. I didn't mention that in my review, and I was annoyed that I didn't, so I'm mentioning it now. I think that's really fun. Next is another book that I also did a video on. I read this book when I was feeling really, really ill. And actually, the video that I did on this book, I was really sick when I made that video. It's Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is one of the first and only YA fantasy books that I've ever read. It's way too bright in here. This is one of the only YA fantasy books I've ever read. And it's fine. It's okay. I've heard people say that they love this, they love it more than her other books. Other people have left comments saying that they preferred her other books. I'm not going to read those. I might read the sequel, it's behind me. I might get to it, don't know. It's fine. Like, it's really an okay story. There were a lot of things that I liked about it and a lot of things that I didn't like about it. The writing starts off particularly poetic and beautiful and then kind of peters out. That is both a good and bad thing about the book. It's a very, very underdeveloped world. I was most frustrated with the world building because you've got a protagonist who starts off in a place that is fantastical and we don't know anything about it. But we're told that whatever place he lives in is just not worth knowing, don't worry about it. The place that he's going to, the place that he's dreamt of going to is far more interesting and fantastical and beautiful and magical, so we'll go there instead. And I'm like, we're already in a fantasy world, can you tell me something about it? No. And between those two places is just a big open desert where he gets to meet and chat with a lot of new people who he then discards as soon as he arrives in the magic place. I don't know, I've already talked about it. It's fine. It was a nice thing to read while I was ill because I could just sit in bed and read it. Very chill, but I didn't love it. Next up are these. These featured in a list that I did on Argentinian books by Argentinian writers. And I made that video because these two books had just come out and I got to read them and I absolutely adored them. The first is A Perfect Cemetery by Federico Falco, translated by Jennifer Croft. And the other is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, translated by Megan McDowell. These are two short story collections. This one is only 5 stories, I think, whereas this one is like 20. They're particularly short, except for one of them, which is massive. It takes up like a quarter of the book. They're both really kind of surreal and strange short story collections. And I'm not really here to compare them, but this one particularly grabbed me. I really went nuts over this book. I thought it was incredible. This is beautifully written, beautifully translated, very thought-provoking. But this is modern Gothic. And I love modern Gothic, I love all Gothic, and I was just enraptured by the attitude of the book, the themes, the tone, the stories, the characters. It is twisted and dark, and it deals with a lot of hauntings and ghosts and witchcraft and cults and paranoia, and it's pretty much all set in one city, and it really gives that city this horrible weight and thick gravity that I loved to pieces. It's a twisted, nasty, gorgeous book that I cannot celebrate enough. It made the shortlist for the International Booker Prize 2021, and I don't know if it's going to win. I haven't read all the books on the shortlist, but I was so happy to see that it made the shortlist. Oh, that's all I needed, honestly. And next up is this. I've made a video on this as well. This is 50 Sounds by Polly Barton, published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, who do incredible stuff. Please check out their shop. Please browse their website and see if anything grabs you. Fitzcarraldo Editions are so good. They always publish just the best stuff. A lot of it is in translation. They've published every Annie Ernaux book, and she's an incredible writer. I've got one of her books behind me. Oh man, and Olga Tokarczuk's books, they've published those. You know, she's a Nobel Prize winner. They're great. And Polly Barton got to write this book about her personal experiences, living in Japan, learning the Japanese language, and her journey to becoming a Japanese to English translator. I loved this book. If you go on our website, I have added this book to about 5 or 6 different lists. We have a list of books on language and translation. I've added it to that. We've got a list of books to read before you go to Japan. I've added it to that. It's everywhere. And each one, I wrote a different write-up about this book, a little paragraph about it, summarizing it in a different way from a different angle because I had so much to say on it. 50 Sounds is a really fantastic book, and I'm so glad that I got to read it. Polly's an amazing writer. She's a great linguist, a great philosopher, a great translator, everything. It's really amazing how she explores the language and culture of Japan through this book. I cannot thank her enough for this. I also read 3 new Japanese books in translation that all got published in April. I have 2 of them here, and one of them is on my Kindle. Again, this was my most recent video before this one was a video celebrating these 3 books. There is Terminal Boredom by Izumi Suzuki, translated by 6 different translators, I think, including Polly Barton, and Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura, which was translated by Philip Gabriel, who's translated a lot of Haruki Murakami's stuff. And then the 3rd book that I read was At the End of the Matinee by Keiichiro Hirono, translated by Juliet Winters Carpenter, who is a magnificent translator. And I really liked all 3 of these books. Terminal Boredom was my favourite. It's a short story collection by an author who is no longer with us, and she was an amazing person, a fascinating actor, model, hostess, and writer. These are speculative science fiction, 7 stories translated by 6 different translators, all sci-fi that comes from a kind of political perspective, which a lot of sci-fi does. And then this is a kind of YA urban fantasy-esque book. It uses a fairy tale fantastical setting, but it does so really to kind of just tell a story about youth growing up, puberty, you know, that kind of period of teenage life, making friends, getting bullied, figuring yourself out, that kind of thing. It's not nearly as fantastical as I thought, even though it's technically set in a mirror world fairy tale castle, the Lonely Castle in the Mirror. It's actually not that fantastical because they spend their time in this castle just chilling playing video games. But it's a really charming book. It's a little long and meandering. It could have been cut down a little bit. And it's funny how many of the twists and turns, as I mentioned in my video, there are so many twists in this book that wouldn't have been twists if the characters had actually just been better at talking to each other. But again, as I said, that is kind of the point. Miscommunication and an inability to talk and open yourself up to people is part of the book's themes, so it makes sense, but at the same time you're like, Jesus, this didn't have to be a twist. You get kind of frustrated, but being frustrated by characters is half the fun. So these are really, really great books. And then the third one, The End of the Matinee, is a lovely, charming romance novel with a few tropes that are a bit exhausted by this point, especially the whole miscommunication. Again, miscommunication. A miscommunication between characters that causes their romance to spiral out of control. But it's a very international book about two people falling in love while traveling the world, and one of them is a very international, mixed race, mixed culture, multilingual person. And they're also two very, very successful people. She is a prolific journalist, and he is an award-winning, beloved, internationally beloved musician. And for the two of them to fall in love around the age of 40, you just don't really see stories like that. And it was just really nice to see that. And the fact that it's a romance novel written by a man, again, we don't see that a lot either. So there's a lot to like about it. Although the tropes wear thin in places and it's a little bit dry despite how interesting it is on paper, it sometimes doesn't actually come across that interesting while you're reading it, because it's very chill and calm in spite of its events. So I have mixed feelings on it. I also have mixed feelings on this. This I have no mixed feelings on. Read this. Read this. But all three of them are definitely worth reading. I talked about them in my video. You can go watch that. I really adored these three books, and I'm so glad that in April we suddenly had three really cool, very different Japanese books that all just fell onto our laps at the same time. That's a really cool thing to happen, and I'm glad I managed to find the time to read all three of them in a single week. That was a good week. The last thing I want to talk about is this. You probably know what this is. This is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. This book is everywhere. It's been everywhere for a year now. When it first came out, it exploded onto the scene. I managed to get this special kind of Christmas edition from Waterstones in this purple and gold, and also it's purple there as well. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So I was glad I got to pick this copy up. And I picked it up after the book was longlisted for the Women's Prize. I was really happy with the Women's Prize longlist, and that longlist led me to read Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, which you can just see here. That is my favourite book of this year so far, I think. Or at least definitely book in English, not in translation. I will probably talk about Detransition Baby more. The day that this video goes up, the shortlist will be announced, and I'm biting my nails hoping that Detransition Baby at least makes the shortlist. But when the long list came out, I thought, right, I'm finally going to pick this up. The day that this book was published, I almost bought it, but I had a list as long as my arm. I always have long lists of review copies to get to, or a TBR list, etc., whatever. I didn't get it. I kept putting it off, and finally I was like, long list, I need to read Detransition Baby, might as well finally pick this up as well. And I was going to do a whole separate video on it, but since I'm here, I'll talk about it now, because I've whooshed through all these other books, so I'll give this one a bit more time. The Vanishing Half is a fascinating book. If you haven't already read it, it is gorgeous. Bernardine Evaristo, who's one of the judges for the Women's Prize, she wrote an introduction to the UK edition, and in that intro she talks about how she's very cynical about literature these days. She finds it hard to find books to really suck her in, and this one did. Like, she was hooked from page one and she was really astonished by it. And I don't wholly agree with that. I actually struggled with this book. I picked it up and put it down multiple times. I would read like 50 pages, and then I put it down and read a whole other book and then come back to it. So I read this book piece by piece over the course of this entire month, and it was still very much worth a read. I actually think it's an incredible book. For some reason, my relationship to it was difficult, and quite often that's not down to the book, that's down to the reader, where they are in their life, what they're looking for in terms of literature, that kind of thing. I really don't think that it says anything about the book, the fact that I didn't chew it up and read it really, really quickly. I think that was me, not the book. If you haven't read it, The Vanishing Half begins in the 1960s in a small town in Louisiana, I think. It's a town called Mallard. It's a made-up town, and it's a weird place, which was founded by a guy who was mixed race, and we're talking in like the 1800s. It's a town for people who do not fit into the white world, but do not identify as black either. And everyone who lives in this town is somewhere between black and white. And it opens with two sisters who are teenagers. They're twins, and they're called Stella and Desiree. When they're 16 years old, Stella and Desiree together run away from Mallard, and they end up in New Orleans, and then their lives take very, very different turns. At the very, very start of the book, we actually begin with Desiree coming home to Mallard with a child, and this is her daughter, and she's run away from something. And this is like 14 years, she's about 30 now, it's about 14 years after she left home, and she's come home to her mother, to her small community. Everyone's whispering about her returning. Desiree, after she and her sister split, she went to DC. She married a black man. He was abusive. They had a kid, and she eventually took the kid and ran out in the middle of the night and returned home with nowhere else to go. And the first half of the book follows Desiree, her daughter Jude, and then Jude eventually turning 18 and going to university in Los Angeles. The book moves from the 60s all the way into the 70s, 80s, early 90s by the end of the book. It spans a lot of decades. It follows Desiree at the beginning, and then her daughter Jude, and then in the second half it moves on to what happened to Stella and Stella's kid. So it spans a lot of people and a lot of time. You have effectively 4 protagonists, the 2 sisters and the 2 daughters, across 4 decades. It's absolutely huge. And it actually is quite a lot to keep track of. It doesn't seem like it, but it can be. Because we do move through time pretty freely without any worry about whether the reader is keeping up. You have to keep up, because suddenly you'll be in a flashback, and if you weren't paying attention, you don't realize you're in a flashback. But it's very rewarding for that, because it's amazing how well Brit Bennett manages to translate subtly the differences of time periods, sort of the language of the time periods and the way that we talk about black culture and the relationship between black and white people from decade to decade. And the kind of, I guess, progress is the word, the progress that the country makes. That's very subtle, it's very, very interesting. But what hooks you, the kind of central conceit of this book is the fact that Desiree is black. She marries a black man, she has a black daughter, she's black. Stella marries a white man and lives a white suburban life in like Beverly Hills and has a really, really good time. These are 2 mixed race twins. One is black, the other passes for white, and has a white kid with a white man. And this is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. What I found was such a relief about the book in a way is that although that is our central hook, and it is our central theme, and it's our central story, it's still the characters themselves that carry the book. Although it is constantly reminding us of this difference between the two, and what that says about broader American culture and, well, still today, it is still bigger than that because it's still mostly about the characters. The characters glue it all together. A lot of books in certain genres rely on themes to carry the message through, and so characters don't get enough attention because it's more about the message, the idea, whatever. That's not the case here. These characters are alive. These are fully fleshed out, detailed, dynamic, interesting characters who really separate themselves from each other. I found it very, very rewarding getting to know each of them. And Stella, in her white suburban life as a white suburban mother, of course you hate her at the beginning. And it's amazing how much self-hatred she contains, but you really grow to pity her more than anyone else in the book. You really feel sorry for this woman who has faked her entire life, who has had to learn self-hatred, hatred of her childhood, her culture, her family, everything. It's really tragic. And she gets to live a kind of life of luxury, passing invisibly into a world that she was not born into, but the sacrifice wasn't worth it. And although you see so much hate and anger in her, you only feel sorry for her. The relationship between her and everyone else, and the relationship between you, the reader, and Stella is electrifying. And it's tragic. She's an amazing character. I'll be thinking about Stella for a long time. To mention Detransition Baby again, the character Ames in that book, I think about Ames every day. One of the most interesting, complex characters I've read in a book in my entire life. And now the same goes for Stella in this book. So yeah, The Vanishing Half is incredible. It's as good as everyone says it is. I took a bit of time to read it. I found that I had to devour it in tiny bite-sized chunks. I'm not sure why. Something about me. But I'm so glad that I read this. And I'm glad that I made this video so that I could actually dig into The Vanishing Half a little bit. It was a very, very worthwhile reading experience. If you've heard about this book and you've heard nothing but hype and everyone talking about how good this book is, and you haven't picked it up, it is worth the hype. It is exactly as good as everyone says it is. The hype was not misplaced at all. This is an incredible book, so please check it out. that'll do it. That was my first ever reading wrap-up. April 2021. Happy birthday to me. Join our Patreon. Subscribe for books. And have a nice time.